Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar on China's crisis of faith and the struggle over moral authority. Thank you all very much for joining us today. We will save some time at the end of our discussion to take questions from the audience, so you can submit those at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of our screen. But let me first introduce our panelists. We have Ian Johnson, who's the author of The Souls of China, The Return of Religion After Mao, a former foreign correspondent and founder of the China Unofficial Archives. We also have with us Lian. Professor Lian is the David Steinmetz Distinguished Professor of World Christianity at Duke Divinity School. His most recent book is Blood Letters, The Untold Story of Lin Zhao, a Martyr in Mao's China. Also joining us is Xiaobo Yuan. She's professor of anthropology and religion at Whitman College and the author of a forthcoming book called Converting China, Urban Christianity and the Politics of Futurity. Today, the starting point for our discussion is the surge of interest in faith and spirituality in China in recent years. Now, there is a lot of evidence for this, and our panel has spent many years thinking about it. So today we want to look at what is behind this growing trend, and at the same time, we're going to look at the government's efforts to strengthen control of society across the board, its efforts to strengthen its control of religious expression, to crack down on online religious content, and to tighten management of religious institutions as it tries to guide the moral lives of the people, foster loyal citizens, and promote traditional Chinese values. So I want to start with you, Ian. And the first question is, how has the religious scene in China evolved over the past decade? I'm thinking particularly since your book, The Souls of China, came out in 2017.
Well, as you said, The Souls of China came out in 2017, and like a lot of books, it has you do your research and then you write it and so on and so forth. So although I was following events up until about 2016 in that book, it is a snapshot of China that's about a decade old. Now, although I think some of the macro trends are the same, some of the things have changed. And I think what's maybe noticeable from my perspective, and it's interesting to see what the other panelists say also, but it's been a more explicit embrace by the party of the so-called traditional faiths, value, or traditions. And there I'm thinking of Buddhism, Taoism, and folk religion at the expense of never support, but at least some kind of tolerance for Christianity and Islam, which we see in the newspaper headlines all the time, that they're under more attack. So I think the party, this isn't something that's happened overnight. It didn't start the moment Xi Jinping took power in 2012, but I think there's been a slow turn toward that. And that's made it harder for Christian groups and Muslim groups to organize. And for example, in The Souls of China, the big urban church that I wrote about, Early Rain, run by a charismatic Protestant preacher named Wang Yi. He's, of course, in jail, as many people may know. I sort of foreshadowed that in the book. He talked about it a lot, that he was often in conflict with the state. But sure enough, a year after the book, after The Souls of China came out, because of his opposition to Xi Jinping's assumption or the planning of a third term, he got into trouble and was sentenced to jail. And that church has essentially closed down, or that's a bit of a simplification because many of the people involved in it are still active. But I think that's symbolic of what's happened to some of these big urban churches that Early Rain was an example of. For example, another one would be the Zion Church in Beijing, a very well-known church that has been not entirely closed down, not everyone arrested, but it's been pushed back to that house church level where that existed before, and that I think the government feels more comfortable with, and didn't like the idea of these house churches uniting and becoming kind of like Chinese mega churches. And they were an entire ecosystem of belief, including kindergartens and even seminaries that they were running, and bookstores and things like that. That the government pretty clearly made clear that it does not want to exist anymore. It doesn't want those kind of civil society structures in religion. And so that's, I think, been one of the big trends that you see, an overall tightening up of control over the past decade, in line with other priorities as well, such as limits on NGOs and so on. So it's part of an overall project. It's good to look at religion, but you have to think of religion in the overall context of China over the past decade or so. And this is very much symptomatic of that overall tightening.
What difference do you think the COVID crisis made?
I don't know if it made a huge difference. I mean, it's a bit early to tell. Initially, of course, it was an excuse for the government to put into place a lot of surveillance systems and mechanisms, a way to keep track of people. I think it strikes me that it might have been more important for the universities and things like that. The churches and other things like that, those were longer term trends of control. The one mountain, for example, folk religious pilgrimage that I spent a lot of time on, Miaofengshan. I went back there a year and a half ago, and that was the first time they'd had the pilgrimage since a proper pilgrimage since the COVID crisis, and it had come back. It was still maybe not as strong as before, but I think those things are coming back. It might be clearer in a year or two from now to make an evaluation of that.
Sure. Professor Yuan, you did some very intensive work in the field research in China just before COVID broke out. And I was wondering if you could tell us what your view is, how things have changed in the intervening years, and maybe talk a little bit about what you did looking at the urban house churches as part of your research.
Yeah, sure. I should caveat this by saying that I haven't returned to China after COVID to do any follow-up research. So a lot of this is sort of secondhand. In my original field research, which I conducted in around 2014, 2013, I worked with this kind of larger network of urban house church, which kind of resembles what Ian was just talking about. You know, they were house churches that had aspirations to become bigger than the traditional house church. They formed a kind of larger network with different nodes in the city of Nanjing where I was working. And they were very inspired by the example of Wang Yi and the Early Rain Church, and as well as like Xiaobo Church and Beijing and other larger unregistered churches. I think one of the interesting things that occurred during the COVID crisis was, on the one hand, I think churches had been developing, especially churches that sort of exist outside of official status, had been developing strategies for meeting in sort of creative and sometimes ad hoc ways for many years before the COVID crisis, right? So they had these tactics of flexibility, right? That they were able to kind of maintain even under severe conditions of surveillance. So I heard from folks, for instance, that knowing that there was a lot of location tracking via cell phone, right, that happened during the pandemic, they would remove their SIM cards, right, or figure out ways to sort of turn off the signal of their phones so that they couldn't be location tracked. There also was a movement or an attempt to move some smaller forms of gathering into individual homes, right? Sort of retreating from certain ways of gathering in large spaces. As the new set of religious regulations were put into place in 2018, a lot of restrictions were put on, for instance, the sort of rental of spaces out to, church groups and religious groups. So they, I think, had to pivot away from certain kinds of public gathering. But from the people I've talked to, sort of who I worked with, they have been prepared for these kinds of changes for a while, and so felt like they were kind of able to employ some of the previous strategies. And I think for some of the urban house churches I was working with, it further sort of exemplified a certain kind of like theological conviction they had that churches weren't about physical spaces, that they weren't about the kind of space of gathering, but they were about a certain kind of relationship to God, and reinforced a sense of almost this return to like an early church form that was often is evoked, particularly in the kinds of Reformed Christianity or Calvinist inflected Christianity, that these were kind of purer forms of churches, that existed sort of in earlier moments in Christian history. So I think, there's a very complicated set of responses to some of the restrictions. But I also found that people didn't necessarily always feel like the restrictions were constraints. Sometimes they also were opportunities to kind of return to like a purer form of gathering.
Thank you. And Professor Lian, you spent a lot of time studying the development of Christianity in China, particularly in the 20th century. How do you see China's religious landscape has changed in the recent years?
Thank you. Again, I will address primarily Christianity. And Ian mentioned earlier two churches. One is the early rain Qiuyu church in Chengdu, and also Xi'an Zion Church in Beijing. And then Xiaobo mentioned the Shouwan Church. And all these three churches officially have been banned, as we know. So one church was banned back in 2011, and then the other two churches were banned in 2018. What is interesting, though, is that if you go look at their website, the Shouwan Church is still having its weekly service, except they are no longer able to meet together in one place, but they've sort of broken up into smaller sort of cell groups and smaller churches, which is a very interesting sign of the resilience of Christianity, even when it was, after it was banned. Now, being banned is not a good thing for the church. We should not romanticize this idea of the blood of the martyrs being the seed of the church. It is bad for the church. On the other hand, we see that these churches do have considerable resiliency. Liu Xiaobo talked about compare different kind of civic organizations, civic bodies, 民间团体, and among the various bodies, environmental groups and political parties and bookstores. If you compare them to the church, we notice one thing that's very different, and that the church, I'm talking about particularly the Christian churches, seem to have quite an impressive kind of resiliency in the face of all these government crackdowns, which has, of course, sort of intensified since 2014.
Thank you. Professor Yan, let me get back to you. This really gets to my next question, which is I wanted to talk a bit about what are the factors that are driving the renewed interest in Christianity. And Professor Lian made a great point about the resilience of believers and the faithful in China. But what do you see as some of the things that are driving people to look for, to turn to religion and spirituality, to look for meaning and guidance?
Yeah, that's a really huge question. So I think there's a couple of ways I think scholars have thought about this question of why religious and spiritual practice has really grown, especially since the beginning of the Reform and Opening Up period. I think one big way to think about it is that this growth is a response to a certain kind of vacuum or a kind of crisis of belief. I think this is a really common narrative to account for this astonishing rise of religious belief and practice that's sort of following this rapid and intense transformation of China in the 1980s, right? Following market reforms and also the kind of accompanying intensification of social alienation and competition, I think, in everyday life, and a certain falling away of the centrality of a shared faith and communist ideology that ordinary people, kind of 老百姓, experience this a kind of spiritual vacuum that needed to be filled, right? And certainly, I think this is a narrative through which people also see their own conversions. I think in my own kind of ethnographic fieldwork, I found many, many stories of people talking about converting when they were at university as a response to the incredibly highly pressurized educational system that they had gone through, in the sense that human value was kind of reduced to a kind of economic measure, right? That value was measured through your economic success, in a very highly fraught and uncertain labor marketplace. I think young people also sought, not just young people, but many people sought a kind of consolation, a kind of stability in religious life that they perhaps didn't find in a very volatile, sometimes seeming kind of economic situation. And we can also think about, people like John Osberg's work on, this new entrepreneurial class who are navigating kind of new economic possibilities, also seeking like a release from, this kind of work in religious or spiritual activities. And also that on the other side of the class spectrum, the sort of marginalized people, rural peasants who had sort of lost a certain kind of position in society, or migrant laborers, or people who were living on the kind of interstices of urban and rural areas who were losing their land, perhaps, right, facing certain kinds of economic and social precarity, go back to many practices of folk religion, right? Like to look for prognostication or divination or fortune telling. So I think that's one explanation, right? And that explanation has had its own like critics as well for perhaps being too functionalist, right? For seeing religion merely as a kind of response or reaction to social ills. So I think there are many, many factors. Other people also talk about actually, rather than seeing sort of religion as opposed to the state and always in sort of countering state restrictions, people also point to intersections between state projects and the rise of religion. For instance, certain kind of, especially during the regime of like Hu Jintao, the sort of slogan of 和谐社会, the harmonizing society, right, that looked to religious infrastructures as a resource for social order and for restoring kind of moral norms. People also look to sort of understanding religion as a form of consumption on the marketplace, right? So as markets are opening up, people also have a variety of choices of where to, find their, spiritual experiences, right? And so religion can also be sought as a kind of consumption that marks certain kind of identities, right? So for instance, in my own experience, when I was working in an urban area, for instance, there was a minor boom in Western style Christian weddings, right? Like people would use wedding planners to plan their weddings in the Western Christian style because it communicated a certain kind of modernity or cosmopolitan identity. So it kind of can be seen as a sort of consumption, right? In my own work, I sort of look at why people go towards religion as also like a way to imagine the future or to construct worlds that they wish to live in, right? Rather than just a kind of reaction to the world that they do live in. So I think a lot of practices like, forming underground schools or seminaries or ways of living collectively are also kind of ways of building towards a future. And the last thing I'll say about this is I also think that it's worth thinking about whether the narrative of this religious revitalization also kind of depends on our definition of religion. And whether, like various forms of Chinese folk practice might have been continuous, right? Like there was never a successful suppression of practices like ancestor worship or tomb sweeping or other kinds of, consultation of deities, even during the height of Maoism, right? But perhaps they didn't meet the sort of standards of the category of religion as modeled on, say, Protestant Christianity, right? So what we see narrated as a kind of rise in religion might also be the imposition of a kind of a category or criteria for determining what appears recognizable as religion.
Ian, you're studying these folk practices. Would you care to respond?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. How you categorize things really can goose the numbers of certain things. And so I'm blanking on the name of the study, but there was a study done about 15 years ago on religiosity in China. And when you ask, the question of 宗教, religion, then you get quite low response rates. But when you ask, do you believe that a spirit or God or or Buddha influenced or affected your life in the past year, then you get like much larger response rates for that. So it sort of depends what you define it as. And I think the way the government is defining some of this now is also quite interesting because they're using this terminology of intangible cultural heritage, which partly to redefine formerly banned religions or religious practices, let's say, as acceptable and even worthy of support. So this intangible cultural heritage is a UNESCO term. It's not, and there's thousands of projects in China that have this support, this term over the past 15 years or so. Not all of them have any religious meaning at all. It could be something like Sichuanese cuisine or Mongolian throat singing or something like that. But there are a number of practices, such as the pilgrimage to Miaofangshan. The pilgrimage itself, the entire pilgrimage is now a national level intangible cultural heritage project, and they want to make it a UNESCO get a UNESCO designation as well. And then the individual religious associations that participate, some of them get national level, some of them, and typical in China is very hierarchical, right? The status is to get national level is the best, right? And then you get sort of city level, provincial level, city level, or county level, or district level, which isn't so good, but it's still pretty good. And this has an effect of normalizing these practices, making them acceptable, but also in some ways making them less religious explicitly, because they become then cultural practices, and it becomes. But it's a double-edged sword for some of these groups. They get some government support. It's not the money isn't the issue really, but it's the prestige and it's the recognition. But the cost of that is that sometimes then you're asked to participate in government holiday celebrations like May 1st or July 1st, the People's Liberation, founding of the People's Liberation Army, or October 1st, National Day. Some of these groups participate in these kinds of events. So I think that these things are on a folk religion level, they've sort of come back, and I also think it's worth thinking of what Professor Yuan said, that it's maybe. Or maybe just riffing off what she said, that it's perhaps not a boom in religion, but a return to some kind of quote unquote normal levels of religious practice. Because it's not like all of Chinese people are all of a sudden religious, or even like a majority of people, but there are a lot more than say 30 or 40 years ago, but it's still not as if most Chinese are going to church or temple or mosque every day. So it's maybe more in line with what you would expect in a Western country that is secularized. But it's just that the base level was so low before because it was artificially pushed down in the Mao era. And so I think we were seeing a return to these more maybe kind of normal levels of religious practice.
Professor Lian, so where do you fall on this question of religious revitalization in China?
Well, both Xiaobo and Ian just mentioned the folk religion, and Ian started out earlier by reminding us of the government's sort of a state's embrace of traditional faith. But I think the situation with Christianity is quite different. It's quite the restrictions are particularly directed at Christianity, even more so than Islam, because I think Islam is more localized. In the case of Christianity, we know that since 2014, the first National Security Blue Book was published that year, which it identified religious infiltration as a key threat to socialism as a societal faith. And you see this Western forces using religious infiltration to try to undermine the party's control. And that was the same year that the Sinization of Christianity effort was officially launched, and we were all familiar with the removal of, at least about 2,000 crosses or so from in Zhejiang province. And then that follow up with the 2018 new religious affairs regulations. And then 2019, we remember that Wang Yang, who is was at the time the chairman of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, at a meeting with national religious leaders, reminded them that the party wants to ensure the religious doctrines must meet the requirements of the progressing times and must fit core socialist values. And even the scriptures must be annotated, and there's been new annotation, new revisions, and retranslation of scriptures where necessary. That's, again, particularly directed at Christianity and Islam, and much more so than traditional faith. So I think the situation is quite dire for Christianity in particular. And but on the other hand, Xiaobo mentions the how there's a sort of consumption of religion, and there's some functions that religion play. I think the same can be said about Christianity, even during the COVID time, for instance, in Wuhan, when the city entered into lockdown, the churches, cell groups switched to online Bible study, and it apparently did help people address the anxieties, the isolation, the difficulties at the time. So we have this this continuing adaptation of religious groups in the face of these very strict government regulations.
Yeah, that really brings me to the final topic that I prepared for today, and that's about the tension between believers and rulers. And so I'd like to ask you, Professor Lian, if you could give us maybe your views on how the faith communities in China, the Christian communities in China, have adapted to the stricter government regulation.
Well, it has adapted at various levels. In the cases of those churches that were banned, as you can see, they've broken up into smaller groups and moved many of the worship and Bible study online. So that's one adaptation. Another trend that I'd like to think about is the fact that the Christian church has been able to move a lot of its religious practice beyond the church walls. And that's something that started way before the Xi Jinping era, in the early years of this century. For instance, back in 2006, there was this 维权律师团 that was organized, Christian human rights lawyers of China, that wanted to take Christianity and its belief, its values to the public sphere, to try to intervene in public life. And then later on, they published what was called the 维权手册, Rights Protection Handbook for Christians. That again is bring this faith into the public sphere and try to influence, make a difference. And I want to use a particular example of Zhang Zhan. Many of us know that in 2020, Zhang Zhan, this who was once practiced as a lawyer, as an attorney, she became a citizen journalist and went to Wuhan to report on the COVID lockdown and the human suffering and the spread of COVID miseries there. And that story is well known, and how back then by December of 2020, she was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Now, that we are familiar with. What is perhaps less known is how Zhang Zhan really fused her Christian belief with her public act as a citizen journalist. And she was distributing these Christian pamphlets at the time that she was in Wuhan. And she famously said, one must seek truth and seek it at all costs. And she wanted to do that as a Christian. And then Zhang Zhan, of course, kept up her resistance in prison again, very much because of her Christian conviction. She sees this as a sort of battle between truth and its opposite. And then Zhang Zhan was released from prison. Her sentence, prison's 4-year sentence, ended in May of this year. And so many of us may have followed Zhang Zhan's story. By July, Zhang Zhan was back in the public space. She started this weekly live stream of her worship. She and a helper started this YouTube live stream worship from a small park next to her apartment in Pudong. So it continued for about 6-7 weeks. And during those weekly sort of broadcasts of the service, attended first by a few dozens, and then maybe 100 or so people, she sort of fused this Christian worship with political commentary. And I recall quite vividly, I was watching her YouTube broadcast, and this was Sunday, August the 4th, this past August. And she started praying, and she prayed that, oh, please move those in God, please move those in power in this country to repent and to be willing to make compromise with democracy, because they are also, the rulers, they are also in bondage. Lord, please set them free with truth, so that they can be free. And it's, and so she continued week after week, this kind of worship and political commentary brought together. There's a very interesting comment made by the former editor-in-chief of the 环球日报 Global Times, Hu Xijing. He said, he had a commentary on Zhang Zhan. He said that the external forces have beguiled her with their indoctrination, creating in her this illusion that opposing the Chinese system was a just and redemptive act. Whether or not that's an illusion, that's a separate matter. But I think it's interesting that even Hu Xijing recognized that Zhang Zhan saw her act as a just and redemptive act, is a religious act. So that's, again, a reminder of how Christianity has been brought by those human rights lawyers, by citizen journalists, by artists, independent filmmakers, into the public sphere. And for the last few minutes, I like to give one particular example of how that has worked in the public sphere. And to do that, I'd like to share a screen of about a someone that many of you already know. His name is He Guanghu, theologian who emerged in the 1980s, Christian theologian, cultural commentator, philosopher, who began to emerge in the 1980s, and he was affiliated with the Chinese Social Science Academy of Social Sciences in the 1990s, and then after that, he was for about 15 years. He was a professor at Renmin University, Beijing Renda. And he started publishing books, really collections of essays, theological essays. And that in the internet age particularly, I think, brought Christianity and Christian messages and values into the public sphere in a way that was simply not possible in the second half of the 20th century. Let me see. So these are some of the other books that are collections of his essays that he has written. And I want to particularly share some of his writings from the last collection that was published in 2021 called 生于忧患, 长于忧患, Born in Sorrow and Grown in Grief, a collection of essays where we see how He Guanghu began to address the some of the public issues from a Christian point of view. And here's a quote where he addresses the problem of moral crisis in contemporary Chinese society. He points out that the reason all these revolutionary moral slogans have failed is because, you see the quote here, there's a fundamental problem. That is, all these prescriptions for moral ailments are secular. The Christian believe that moral laws were instituted by God and therefore cannot be breached, has of course become an important resource for healing the moral ailments in China. You can see, not just in a very broad and general way, but he also is prepared to address some very specific problems that people encounter in their family life in society, fragmentation of family, what he calls the desertification of the society, right? And he wrote that the church fellowship and cell group activities and friendly, close human relationship formed this way have been able to counter such atomization of individuals and a sense of being adrift. They can again bring many people a degree of psychological relief. And he even commented on this, some of the deadly arsons on bus, and to remind people how church or a church attendance or becoming a church member can make a real difference, can discourage this kind of deadly acts. And of course, we are reminded of what just happened in Zhuhai. And I can imagine He Guanghu addressing the same kind of this terrible, incidents of this, violent incidents, with the same kind of Christian message that there is a way that Christianity can address such kind of crisis. Just one more example, and then I'll stop. He talks about the cultural, even Christianity can be a cure for autocracy, and He Guanghu address another very prominent issue or a real problem in contemporary China, which is ultra-nationalism. And he points out that this ultra-nationalism, what he calls, is a kind of statism that goes all the way back to antiquity, and that Christians must reject ultra-nationalism because it's not compatible with our national interests. It's not compatible with the of individual rights. And anyway, I won't take up too much time. I'll stop there. But just a reminder of how Christianity, in the face of all these government restrictions and and crackdown has been able to find a voice in the public, to project a voice in the public space.
Well, that's really the great challenge, right? Is that these issues really come down to fundamental values and what people believe in their hearts, and the governments that try to change that find that, of course, it is incredibly difficult to do. And Ian, you talk about a bit about this in your book, The Souls of China. The difficulty of getting people to change their minds, really.
Yeah, no, I think it's worth maybe looking forward a little bit also, and maybe along the same lines that right now these groups, pretty much all groups in China, even the groups that get some favor from the government, are having a harder time than, say, 15 years ago in the more freewheeling go-go years when things were happening. But even of course, when we haven't spoken too much about Islam, but Islam is under incredible pressure. But even the groups like, say, these folk religious groups at Miao Fengshan, when I went to the pilgrimage a year and a half ago, at the top of the mountain was a big poster, a giant poster, which was the oath that you take when you join the Communist Party. So it had sort of this wavy communist, hammer and sickle flag, and next to it is this giant oath. It's like, is this a meeting of the Communist Party, Communist Party members, or is it a religious place? And other ones, I went to a Taoist temple also on that trip, and they used to have kids from the local village who would come for calligraphy lessons in the temple, in the nunnery, and they would be, and of course, what would they be copying? They'd be copying the Tao Te Ching or some, Taoist text, and then maybe for a few kids this might influence them, and that was their hope. But now minors are not allowed into places of worship, into religious activity centers, they're called. So they're not allowed to have those classes anymore. So it affects other people as well. So even these ones that get some favor from the government as being seen as perhaps more malleable or supporting some state narrative about protecting traditions and so on, even they feel the heavy hand of the government. But I felt that all of these groups are still active, they're still in weight, and when the pendulum swings back again, as it might in the future, we can't assume that the current situation in China will be like this forever. I mean, I think that's a mistake that one makes, always, straight line projections, that they will be able to take advantage of that in the future and move forward. So I think there is a lot of tensions between rulers and ruled in this issue. Well, I think right now people are by and large doing what they do in any situation like that, which is to hunker down and wait for better times to come.
Professor Yuan, what's your view on how the faith communities in China have adapted to the increasing government regulation?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question for further study. One of the things I think that on the ground research in China by a number of scholars dealing with sort of the interactions between religious groups and the state is that often it's negotiated on this kind of local level. So while there are overarching national level policies that regulate religion, or for instance, a kind of promotion of like sinicization, right, of different religions, shaping it to what's considered to be a kind of Chinese tradition or Chinese characteristics, how those are implemented or enforced are often quite localized. And I often saw this that in the kind of practical dealings between, for instance, unregistered Christian churches or meeting spots and local officials, it was about sort of often personal relationships between local officials and, say, religious practitioners or pastors. So I think it kind of remains to be seen in some ways how these overarching larger restrictions on religion play out. And there are also sort of regional, I think, variations in terms of how strict enforcement can be. But I do agree with both the speakers today that this particular moment in the religious life in mainland China seems quite dire, right, for many religious groups. I think one of the things that strike me is that even in using or trying to kind of mobilize religious practice to, harmonize society or create social order or sort of reinforce moral norms, the government has a very hard time controlling the terms by which religious groups or commentators think about issues. For instance, I remember, instances of Buddhist monks or nuns during COVID pandemic commenting on the COVID pandemic as a kind of consequence of certain social ills, environmental degradation, right? Certain kinds of over excessive forms of consumption that have resulted in, contact with different kinds of viruses. So there's always a kind of quote unquote like danger of religious commentary or religious perspectives on social issues sort of getting out of the kind of tight control of like government controlled civic discourse, which is I think why you see so much internet censorship and why religious groups have also been quite adaptable in trying to get around, certain kinds of internet censorship by using creative characters or symbols or icons that aren't as easily surveyed or easily, managed by online censors. So it's always this interplay between, the kind of the goals and aims of the state and policing religion, their like local enforcement and the way in which religious groups, I think, adapt to them.
Yeah, it's interesting. During COVID, people were stuck at home for long periods of time, really living their lives online. I don't know if you'd followed at all how the faith communities in China used that moment to try to expand their reach or to just connect with other people in their communities. Yeah, Professor Yuan, did you
Right.
I don't know if you
Oh,
followed
yeah.
that very much, that
Yeah.
phenomenon of people of sort of services going online, Bible study being conducted
Mhm.
online. If
Yeah,
you,
I think that
yeah.
had been a trend that, the online spaces are really integrated into people's religious lives even before COVID. And obviously, after COVID and after the shutdown of in-person gatherings, the in sort of promotion of these online spaces also increased. And we're seen as, for example, like outside of Christianity, Buddhist services for those who are dying or sick were moved online, right? And people at various Buddhist associations were encouraged to set up their own home religious spaces, right? To use, a particular small space in their home to reproduce a space of, chanting or worship or devotion. And I think the sort of the space for scriptural reading, Bible study, also became very concentrated online.
Mm.
So I think those practices were actually also in play before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, they became really important resources for people as they were isolated. And I think religious groups also at that time provided a kind of care network, right, for people maybe who were isolating in their homes. They were an alternative kind of social network in which people provided mutual care for each other as well.
Professor Lian, I wanted to follow up with something you said earlier about the foreign interference. So just along the same lines as the question about people moving their worship online, how have the churches dealt with these accusations that they're agents of foreign powers or they're acting under foreign influence?
Well, I don't think the church has been in a position to really defend itself and such groundless, of course, groundless charges. The best it can do is to adapt, as we've heard both Ian and Xiaobo talk about, and so that's that. It's really a reminder that there are perhaps limits to what the church can do in the face of this, and we are reminded all the time of how harsh these crackdowns continue to be. I mentioned Zhang Zhang earlier, and many of us may already know that Zhang Zhang was back in jail by the end of August for trying to come to the help of another Christian, a new convert, a dissident. So we have these constant reminders of how difficult it is now for the church, particularly.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important point. We have a few questions I want to get to, but just before we wrap up, Ian, I wanted to ask you. You had a recent article in the New York Review of Books, your review of Perry Link's and Wu Dazhi's new biography of Liu Xiaobo, and in that article you talked about the lack of interest in doing what I hope we've done today, which is to explore some deeper trends in Chinese culture, in society. And you talked about how concerning it was that many people are dismissive of China and see it as deserving, I quote here, deserving little more than opprobrium. So I just wanted to ask you, I know you have this new initiative that you're working on, Ian, on putting together an archive of some underground and samizdat unofficial archives. And so I wanted to ask you, looking at the field of religion, how do you see the attitudes among the journalists and the writers who are covering China today, and what might they do to foster a better understanding of what's really happening on the ground in this very obviously very complicated topic?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think what I was trying to get at there is somebody like Liu Xiaobo, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, died in prison. That biography, for example, which is really an epic biography and a sort of a tour de force of Chinese intellectual life in the late 20th century, that did not get reviewed in any mainstream big press like the New York Times or the Washington Post. And I think that would have been inconceivable a generation ago when thinking about Soviet dissidents and thinkers. So I think people were much more aware. And in fact, when I was looking at my bookshelf when I was writing that, and there's this enormous doorstopper of a biography of Solzhenitsyn that was published in the 80s, and that got reviewed everywhere. So it wasn't that the Perry Link biography or whatever was too long. It was just, I think, that there's this lack of sort of serious engagement with Chinese thought, and this idea of it's easy to write it off, especially. It's almost like either whether you're coming from the left or the right of the spectrum, you just say, oh gosh, it's terrible in China today. It's a black hole. There's nothing going on there. And I guess, but I wouldn't criticize so much the journalists. Maybe that's because I'm a former journalist and I have some professional solidarity, but there have been such cuts to the number of journalists When I was accredited for the New York Times a decade ago, there were something like 10 or 12 people accredited just for the Times. And now I think there are two. And so it's hard for them to keep up with the news, let alone do in-depth pieces on, say, religious life or whatever. But I think what it's also addressed at universities, think tanks, at foundations. I think we should try, and other public institutions that do film festivals and stuff like that, that there could be more invitations extended to Chinese thinkers across the board. And I know there are some logistical reasons why that's difficult. Language, for example, many Chinese don't speak English. So if you invite them to be your writer in residence or whatever, it's going to be difficult for them to teach a class and so on. So I get that. But I think that it's striking that even, major documentary filmmakers like Hu Jie, there's never been a major film retrospective of him at a big film festival. There are independent film festivals that do stuff like that, but I mean, it's a big one. And so I think there's this need to try to not write off China, but to engage with it precisely now when it is difficult to engage, when it's hard to get people there. I think universities need to send more people there. The students should be encouraged to go. I think professors need to take their students there. It needs to be somehow, it's exactly now when we need more people looking at China, not fewer people, not everybody saying, I don't think I'll go back. I think people really need to go back, not to provide some photo op for the government to show that everything's normal. I mean, there's always a risk in a propaganda state, but to find out what's really going on the ground. We can't rely on just a dozen journalists or so.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ian. And hopefully we'll all get back there and at some point and catch up with what's going on with these latest trends. Now, we did get a few questions. I want to take this one and share it with Professor Lian. Professor Lian, can you talk a bit about the religious economy and how the money-making activities of churches are governed?
Thank you. That's an important question. I wish I had more up-to-date information on that. The government has often used the money-making, the business side of the church, as the sort of as a way to beat up the church and pile all accusations. The same case with Wang Yi's church, when one of the charges brought against the early reign church has to do with its business operation. And going back to Cai Zhuohua, the printing of the Bible, Christian literature things back in the early 2000s, again, we see more of these charges being brought by the government against these Christian churches, more as just as a way, as an excuse to crack down on the church. But I wish we have more information coming from the church itself, and quite understandably why we don't have that information, because the church finds itself in a very tight space. And but I don't think the church as a whole has been in the business of making money, even though that is precisely the charge brought against them.
Yeah, that's been a big problem with people accused of fraud and all kinds of things like that. I think maybe we have time for one more question. Professor Yuan, someone's asking about the difference between how the government treats Buddhist communities and Christian and Muslim ones. Professor Yuan?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself. Yeah, I think there's, so I'm not an expert in Islam or Buddhism in China, but I would say that from what I've observed, Buddhism is considered sort of closer to Chinese tradition, closer to this kind of ideal of Sinicized religion than other religions that are seen to be essentially foreign imported. So Christianity and I think Islam are understood to be essentially tied to a kind of foreign origins. So that creates a difference, I think, in how these religions are regulated or promoted by the government. On the other hand, all recognized religions in China are in their official forms sort of regulated by religious associations, national religious associations in China that all across the board are expected to conform to certain standards of sort of patriotic alignment with the state. So there's something that religions share. But I think it's also important to recognize that there has been really severe crackdowns on Muslim communities in China, particularly in Xinjiang, among the Uyghur communities. And I think one of the differences here is that there's a kind of conflation or overlap between sort of, Islam as a religion and the status of ethnic minorities or ethnic nationalities in China, right? So in that way, right, Islam is often associated with these ethnic minority groups, right? For instance, like Uyghurs and Huiming and the sort of the south, the western, northwestern parts of China. So some of the practices that were once sort of considered to be cultural practices of ethnic minorities that were protected, right, by the state, are now under attack for purportedly spreading Islam, right? For instance, so like in Xinjiang province, for instance, all religious education, religious schools have been banned. Face coverings worn in public have been banned. Any kind of association with Islamic networks outside of China has been banned. And a general kind of attack on, I think, Uyghur culture has been implemented with this kind of understanding of the kind of threats to national security that Muslim separatism poses, right? And this really dates back to anxieties over Muslim terrorists or, violence, public violence from several kind of isolated incidents of Uyghur separatist violence in Xinjiang. So, a lot of I think these are really, this is a really important question because the kind of implementation of religious regulations is also very complicatedly tied up in political and social issues of like ethnic differentiation in China. And I think one of the questions for me is sort of what kinds of solidarities are possible between religious communities in China, given these very different experiences with the state.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for joining me today for this discussion. Obviously, this is just a huge topic, and 1 hour is not enough to really do it justice. But we will be looking at this very closely at the Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China Analysis, myself and some of our other fellows, and in collaboration with fine folks like yourself, we plan to do more similar events along these same lines. So please stay tuned. So I just want to say thank you once more, and I really appreciate your time and your very, very valuable insights today. So thank you all very much, and thank you for watching.
Thank you.